What's up, everybody, and welcome back to In Search of Answers, the series where you ask me questions and I do my best to answer them. We got some really fun ones lined up today, a lot of like community sort of central topics for today's episode. So we're going to get right into those as soon as we can. Quick reminder, if you'd like to ask a question to be answered potentially here on the show, ways to do that are to either A, leave a comment below on YouTube if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you're on Patreon, if you're a patron, you can post your comment or post your question as a comment on the listing, either directly on Patreon, or if you find the listing for this episode over there, you will find a form you can fill out that will let you do things like say who you want me to call you on the show and stuff like that, just for a little bit of extra customization if you want it. But anyway, let's get into today's questions. First one comes from Shark over on Patreon, who's asked a whole bunch of questions for the show in the past, and they've always been bangers. This one is no less. It says, does it feel like gaming communities have gotten much more negative over the last few years? This isn't something exclusive to WoW, but I've noticed it with WoW forums. It's hard to find good conversation about my favorite games that isn't just people complaining about the latest thing. I feel it wasn't this bad in years past. So there's actually a lot of different factors that can contribute to this and what ends up feeling like the almost inevitable negativity about any sort of community online, especially one in games, but it happens in all sorts of different products. There's like super negative things about various tech products. There's like car forums that can get like super negative about the cars that they're ostensibly all there because they like the cars, but there's still like primarily negative discussion about this and that thing that they don't like. And there's a lot of different reasons why this occurs. And there's a lot of different factors that specifically to gaming, I think, are interesting to talk about. So here's an idea. Let's talk about it on this talk show. So the first thing that I want to talk about in this is just kind of, man, where do I even start with this one? Let's start with just general human nature, right? I think it's important to recognize that we as a species are basically built, we're basically hardwired at our core to try to improve our situation. Whatever our current status quo is, we want to try and make it a little bit better. We want to try to make that a little bit better, make that a little bit better, and make that a little bit better. And unfortunately, the way that tends to manifest is that it means that we are very, very good, again, as a species, I'm speaking in broad generalizations right now, but humans as a species are very, very good at identifying when we don't like something or identifying whatever the current worst thing is. And that comes from that core, like, sense of wanting to improve things. That comes from that core of, I need to figure out what I don't like so that way I can change that. And thus my life will feel better in some way or another. Even if it's, a video game, like it's still, I will be happier playing this game if this thing is changed. And that's just a core thing of how humans operate. Now, that again, that's a broad generalization. I'm not saying every single person acts that way. And it's also often something as well that a lot of people will get that notion. They go, yeah, that kind of sucks. But just because they try to be very positive people, for example, they might say, yeah, that kind of sucks, but I'm not going to focus on that. I'm instead going to change my focus on this other thing that I really like over here. And there are a lot of people that just generally end up being very positive as a result of that because they're just looking for the things that are positive. But I would say on a broad scale, like landscape, the state of the human species, if you get enough of us together, there's going to be more people that are finding those things that they don't like and focusing thus on those things that they don't like because they feel like if this can be fixed, then it will be improved and things will be better and I will be happier as a result. There's going to be more of those people, especially the larger a group gets, there's going to be more of those people. So as the sample size of humans gets larger and larger and larger, that average tends to come out for slightly more negativity. And the reason that this is really important to this specific question as well is like contributing to this factor of, or this thought of don't feel like it was this bad until it wasn't this bad in years past is exactly what Shark said. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that there's just a lot more gamers these days. There's just a lot more people contributing to these discussions. And especially for a huge game like World of Warcraft, you see it in big games like Fortnite, League of Legends, etc. All of these games, the massive, huge games with tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of players, there tends to be a lot of negativity in those communities. Even games like Final Fantasy XIV, which is renowned for having a very, very positive and welcoming community. There have been people, I've seen these discussions recently, where people are saying, yeah, it's not as positive as it used to be. And that is possibly, and I would say probably, somewhat related to the fact that Final Fantasy XIV has really sort of taken off in the past few years as a much larger community now than it used to. And as a result, as the group of people rises, as the more people there are in a group, excuse me, the more likely negativity is to start to dominate discussions. And there are some ways that that can be sort of dealt with. For things like Final Fantasy, for example, I think part of why that community is still so positive compared to others is through something I call tone setting. It's the idea of you sort of elevate and you really set like, this is what we want to be about. This is what our community is about. This is how we want to be. And if you can get that to be so well put into place and so well established that everyone who comes into that community recognizes that's what they're going for here, that's what the vibe is. If you can get that to stick, then you'll be much more successful in that regard. Now that's very difficult to do, for the record, and I applaud the Final Fantasy 14 community for holding on to it as well as they have, because it's very difficult. Like once a tone has been made negative, it is almost impossible to turn that back around. It is very, very difficult, especially for a game as large as World of Warcraft. So for World of Warcraft community, a lot of it is like trying to like put in those moments, like from a community management perspective, I would assume still, I know when I was there, this was my approach, trying to find those things that are positive and try to find ways to elevate things that are good, and trying to occasionally just have conversations that aren't about whatever the most negative thing about the game is. That in turn, obviously, can rub some feathers the wrong way. Is that what I'm trying to say? I don't know. It can rub some people the wrong way when you're like, why is there's a giant thread over here of people who are all angry about shaman balance or whatever, and you're over here talking about how you're posting in this different thread talking about how much you like this person's screenshot or whether like people actually get mad about that because they feel that you've given this attention instead of this what they feel to be more important issue. So it's very difficult is basically what that boils down to. It's very, very difficult to try and trend things that way. But that also leads me into the second point that I wanted to make about this, which is I feel like the more, and I know this for a fact, actually, categorically, this is something that I've researched during my time as a community manager and even prior. I know for a fact that the more involved a development team is with the development of their game, and the larger, when you combine that with a larger audience, the more involved a development team gets with discussions in a certain space, in a certain like part of the internet, the more negative those discussions trend to be. And that is because the people that are then posting there are no longer just talking to each other about, let's talk to each other about the World of Warcraft. Yeah, let me tell you, oh, what do you play? What do I play? Blah, blah, blah. You're not having those sort of like base level discussions anymore. You're now having every discussion as though someone from the development team is going to read what you said. And that just changes the tone of things. That means that you now feel, and the average poster now feels, well, two things. One, the average poster now feels that they need to be making a point with everything that they're saying. There needs to be some element of feedback to this so that if a dev reads it, now they're going to understand and something's going to be improved about the game. See, previous note about human beings and just our base, like hardwired need to improve our situation. But the second thing is it then attracts more people who otherwise wouldn't have posted at all. Like they otherwise just would have been off being angry about something in a corner by themselves. But now that they know that they can potentially get read by the development team or seen by the development team if they post in this spot, yeah, obviously they're going to come in here and they're going to be listing out their list of these are things that I don't like. These are things that I think need to be improved, etc. That's just naturally how things tend to go in that regard. So it's a lot of it is literally just the larger a community gets, the more negativity there's going to be for a number of different factors. The more involved a development team gets, the more negativity there's going to be naturally, because now people feel like they have this line to the development team. So they feel it's more valuable for them to share the things that they don't like. This is all just natural. This is just completely normal stuff. This is how people are. This is how people work. And unfortunately, that means it's a huge part of the job of a community manager to try to pull that stuff together in certain ways and try to make things as positive as possible. Now, I will say one exception that I've noted to the rule tends to be Discords, actually. And I think that comes from, it's not a rule. There are lots of exceptions to this, but I tend to find that Discords are a little bit more positive toward whatever game it is that they're talking about. Again, with a lot of exceptions, but on average, the average Discord about a video game is going to have discussions in it that are a bit more positive. And that's just, I think at least, my theory there is that's because a Discord feels a lot more informal. It feels less like I'm going to write my report on the situation in the game. I'm putting together a large post. I'm not doing that. I'm literally just going into this like Marvel Snap Discord, for example, to be like, yo, Silver Surfer is kind of crazy, right? Like stuff like that. I tried this and this happened and that was crazy. Look at this ridiculous amount of power that I managed to get in this match and so on. That's the sort of thing that tends to take place more often in Discords. So as a result, that can kind of drown out a little bit, the like, hey, developers, you need to fix this, or wow, this thing is so stupid, I hate this, and so on discussions that happen. I'm not saying that every Discord or even most Discords are then a net positive situation. There are a lot that are, but I find they tend to be for smaller games and smaller communities where it's more about people who just really like the game and want to support it and hope that it becomes popular. I guess that's kind of another thing to note as well. Once something is seen by the general community, the general consensus is that this is a successful title, there tends to be a sort of falling away. The tone sort of shifts from, wow, I believe in this product and I think it can be very good and I hope more people see how good this game is so that it can become successful. It shifts from that into, It shifts from that tone into, well, this game is obviously super successful and it's because of all of the hard work that the community put into it, or at least in part to all the hard work that the community put into this and all the loyalty that they've gotten from the community that's surrounding it. So now that this product is successful, now that this game is seen as a successful game that is, people always say raking in millions, even if it maybe necessarily isn't, but still, it's a monetarily successful title. The expectation then shifts to, okay, now you need to be doing as much as you can to make me happy, to make me want to continue playing your game, to make me as the player more invested in your product. Whereas previous, it was, no, I'm invested in you. Now it's like, no, you need to make me invested, and so on and so forth. So hopefully that made some sense. I feel like I explained that a little bit weirdly, but hopefully you get where I'm going with that. The bigger a game gets and the more successful a game gets, and especially if a game calls itself AAA or is considered to be AAA, that sort of shifts the expectation from the players and from the community members quite a bit, to the point where they now feel like, okay, it's not my responsibility to make this game be successful. It's that the game is not counting on me to be successful, which in turn means that you are less likely to talk about the things that you like about the game because you don't feel that's as important anymore. You don't feel that's as urgent that you tell everyone how much you love this video game, because you're not trying to convince people to come and play it. You feel like there already are people playing it, so you don't need to convince more people that it's worth a look. Those are a few different reasons why I think that's the case. And I will say also, like, I think there's a little bit of rose-colored glasses to the framing of this question and to the thought of it wasn't this bad in years past. Like, I've been playing video games and talking about them on the internet as long as, basically since I was like 8. It was a lot. The year started with a 1 when I started talking about video games on the internet, just so we're clear. This was back in the 90s. When I first got into this on a 56K modem. And there's always been negative discussions about everything. It's literally just, I think it's harder to get away from it nowadays because the communities are so large. And it's harder to look at someone who is just one person and being like, wow, this guy in our IRC chat really seems like he hates this game. Why is he even here? Dude, why don't you go play another video game? You seem to really hate this one. Go play something else instead. It's much easier when it's like one person in an IRC chat with like 30 people in it than it is when it's 1,000 people in a forum with 30,000 users and so on. Much more difficult, much more easy to, if you're the person who's trying to be that sort of voice of positivity, voice of reason, it gets much more difficult when you feel like you can get ganged up on by even a handful of people who are all going to jump out from nowhere to defend the person you were disagreeing with. And people who are trying to be positive generally don't want to get in the middle of flame wars. So it's just kind of the nature of thing. Again, the larger a community gets, the more it's going to trend negative, just naturally because of how human beings are. And that's not like a doomer thing about like, oh, humans are just negative people or anything like that. It's just literally if you have a group of 50,000 people and 48,000 of them are super positive, that still leaves 2,000 people who are being negative, and 2,000 negative people can change the tone of an entire discussion. That's just sort of the nature of how it is. Anyway, hopefully that helps explain that a little bit. It's definitely a lot of like science and almost psychology is the word I'm looking for, about how all of this stuff works and how all this fits together, which is why I love talking about it, because it's fascinating to me. Like humans are really weird creatures. We're very very weird. But hopefully that helps explain that a little bit. I'm going to move on to the next question, because this is another one that's very sort of community and discussion focused. This one comes from Goblin Graphics on YouTube, who said, speaking of Greg Ghostcrawler, what are your thoughts on his studio's very open discussion of the game they're developing? Is being that transparent good for a studio, or could it lead to issues or pitfalls? I love that this question came up, because this is something that I've been thinking about a ton ever since they first started doing this. So if you're not familiar, Greg Street, aka Ghostcrawler, used to be the lead systems designer on World of Warcraft. He then went to Riot for a while, where he was working on their still unannounced MMORPG. And at least I think it's still unannounced. If it has been announced, I haven't heard about it. He has more recently split off to form a new studio, a much smaller studio, called Fantastic Pixel Castle, which I'm just going to abbreviate as FPC for the rest of this video, because I have a really hard time saying Fantastic Pixel Castle. I don't know why. My face just does not like to make those sounds in that order. But yeah, he has this new studio, FPC, that he's putting together, and with a lot of like really solid names working on this team as well. Like, it's not just Greg all by himself coming up with stuff. Like, honestly, a lot of my favorite people from working on World of Warcraft are also working at FPC nowadays, working on this. It's called Ghost. Well, Project Ghost is this game that they're working on. They haven't given an official title for it yet. But like, Brian Halink is there, Candace Thomas is there, Graham Berger is there. Like, these are people who I worked with on World of Warcraft, and I'm super stoked that they're now like, they have their own studio and they're getting to make their own MMORPG, and it's really exciting to me, and I can't wait to see what they come up with. I'm really, really stoked for it. But one really super interesting thing that they're doing that Goblin Graphics is asking about here is they're talking about their game. Like, literally, that's the extent of it, but they're talking about their game. They're talking about what they're working on. And why that's so interesting is that this game is like probably 4 or 5 years out still. Like, it's gonna be a while before this thing is even playable, let alone released. They are very, very early in development, and they're working on some real core concept stuff right now. And so their idea is, we're going to make this game in partnership with the community from the start to finish. We're going to be showing you guys what we're working on constantly, so that way, as we're making these early choices, you guys get to know what these early choices were, assuming that you're paying attention. Obviously, there's a lot of people who see it, and then I'll get back to that in a second. There's a lot of people who see it and then immediately go, there's nothing to see here. What am I doing? And then just move on. But we'll get back to that in a second. The idea is, by having this be something that they can talk about so early, they can get their ideas out there, they can really sort of express what they're working on to the community early. That will allow the community then to like indicate what things they like, what things they don't like, what concerns they have, and expressing those concerns early enough that then the development team can go, okay, hold on. Somebody said this about this thing that we're working on the other day. Is that actually a problem? Do we need to think about how we're going to solve that a little bit better? What sort of things should we have in mind? So that in theory, the idea is, by talking about this game so early, they will be able to thus make a better product in the end, because it's something that the community has been able to sort of check their answers on this entire time, sort of will serve as that sounding board for all of their ideas from the beginning. Now, there are obviously a lot of potential pitfalls for this, which is why I find it fascinating. First off, I want to start, before I even go into this, I love that they're doing it. I am watching this closely to see how well it goes, because it is such an experiment and it is such a risk by doing this and by expressing things so early this way. One of the obvious potential pitfalls that I think a lot of people think of immediately is, well, if you're talking about what your game is this early, what's stopping someone else from making this game faster than you? That is a concern, but it's not like, I don't think it's a real one. I don't think it's as likely to be the case that someone's going to somehow or other hit on like, oh, wow, did you guys see what FPC was talking about in their latest Ghost thing? We should put that in our game and do it faster and get out before them so that we can beat them to the punch. It is possible. I don't think that's as big of a risk as people would really necessarily expect, just because it turns out making a video game takes time. And a lot of times trying to shoehorn those choices in and shoehorn those like late game design choices in when you're like super far into the development of your game. Basically, if they were going to do this, Either they would still need to develop the entire game, which puts them behind where FPC is anyway, or they would have to shove it into a game that they're already mostly completed. And oftentimes that just makes things worse and it ends up feeling clunky and bad. And so then people just don't like it anyway. So then FPC comes out with Ghost and they're like, oh yeah, this is much better than that other game that tried to copy this idea. So I'm not as worried about that particular risk. What I am worried about is the more community facing aspects of this. And we've already started to see a little bit of this starting to show itself, not in like a catastrophic sense by any stretch of the imagination as of yet. But one example, they showed some screenshots of the game that they're working on a while back. And these screenshots were from an incredibly early development build. And they were literally just screenshots of like stuff inside the Unreal editor that they were working on because they're using the Unreal Engine for it. And what's interesting was a bunch of people went, wait, I didn't realize that this was a science fiction video game, but the main character is a robot. So obviously this is a science fiction video game set in the future, right? Because the main character is a robot. And they had to clarify, like, no, that's literally just what the default model for a player. If you haven't set a player model in Unreal Engine, that's just what you look like when you try to be a player inside your game and run around inside of your environments that you put together. There were a few other things where they were like, they had to point out, like, see these like mountains in the background. Yeah, those aren't real. Those are just temporary assets that we're using just to kind of express the concept of an idea. And I think what we're starting to see a little bit with Project Ghost and with what they're doing over there is just the idea, like, gamers are not used to seeing this far behind the curtain. Gamers, they will look at this and they do not know what they're looking at. And that's a huge part of the challenge, is educating people as you're showing them this super early stuff, this super incredibly early, like, no one has ever seen a game in this state. Well, very few people, I should say, have seen a game in this state publicly, and definitely not as like a, hey everyone, come and look at this and see what your or give us your thoughts on what you think about this whole thing. That's not really happened before. So a lot of people are looking at it and they're just seeing, like, what they see right away is not necessarily the thing that the development team is trying to get you to look at. So in the case of those screenshots that I was mentioning before, the point of them putting them out wasn't to be like, hey, what do you think of these mountains? Hey, what do you think of this player model? It was more to be like, here is a beginning of something that we're kind of working on that will later eventually be like, I don't remember exactly, like a vendor or something like that. Or here is where an NPC would be if I had one, sort of situations. Which is going to be very interesting to see how they can manage the aspect of trying to let players know, like, okay, I'm going to show you something. This is the part of it that you should be looking at. I need you to ignore all of this stuff because it's not relevant. These graphics over here are not going to be used again. And players tend to gravitate towards graphics very quickly. Graphics and UI are kind of the first thing that players tend to see. It always cracks me up when I see suggestions for a video game that's like, why don't you just add a button that lets you toggle this? And it's like, well, it's not. Adding the button is by far the easiest part of what you just described. Having like I don't know, the random example. If people wanted a button to be able to toggle between like mid-raid, toggle between difficulties, for example. Like if you were like halfway through a raid and you're like, dang, really want to drop this down to normal difficulty so we can kill this boss and then go back to heroic afterwards because I don't want to spend time on it. I've genuinely seen, not the specific suggestion, but I've genuinely seen suggestions over the years that were like, oh yeah, they should just add a button that lets you do that. They could put the button right here. It would be so easy. And it's like, okay, yes, putting a button there would be easy. Rendering a JPEG in this part of the screen would be very easy. All of the back end stuff that you're just hand waving off is just put a button here. That's the actual hard part of it. The reason I bring that up in relation to what's going on with Ghost is I feel like players are going to end up, and a lot of like the average MMO gamer, the average gamer in general, is going to look at what they're doing right now, and they're going to gravitate towards things like, where is the button on the screen? Or what does this character look like? Or what's going on with the terrain over here? They're not as much going to inherently, just because it's not something that people are used to being exposed to, they're not going to as much recognize like, okay, what I'm supposed to be looking at here is that they've done some work towards this concept of an idea for an NPC that will do a thing, or they've started to put together the concept of how PvP is going to work in their game, and so on and so forth, stuff like that. It's it will be interesting to see how well they address that, essentially, is where I'm going with that. And it's going to take a lot of very, very careful community management over the next several years. They did just recently hire a community manager. I think, frankly, and this is probably me being a little bit biased, but Greg, you're going to need a whole team. And I think you're going to need a whole team a bit earlier than you might expect because of this thing that you're doing. You're going to need a whole team of people whose job is to make sure that people understand what you're showing them, because that's the big challenge for showing people stuff this early in development. But I am very, very interested to see where it turns out. There's a few other potential pitfalls in there as well. There's always the risk of like, there's always the risk, something of a risk of people understanding a little bit too much about how the game works behind the hood, then being able to use that to find exploits much later on, because some information that's still lingering from 4 years ago turned out to still be relevant in the game much later on. And it pointed someone to where to look to find some exploit or something like that. It's a risk. I don't think it's a huge one, but it is a risk. And also it's the sort of thing where people might genuinely just be tired of the game by the time it releases. Like, building hype you want to build up a little bit, you want to get really exciting about your game, and then immediately have something that players can do. If you have been around for so, like Star Citizen has this problem where Star Citizen has been around for so long that it could announce a release date tomorrow, and the reaction to that would be, oh, Star Citizen still hasn't released? Like that would be the level of reaction that game would have at this point. It's very clear to see with games like that, where they've just been in the public mind for so long that it doesn't matter that it's finally coming out for some people. It's just going to be a case of like, yeah, I lost interest in that ages ago. There's a limited amount of time in which you can keep someone engaged in a product without them actually being able to play it. Fortunately for I will actually somewhat defend. I know that there's a lot of like issues with Star Citizen and how its monetization has worked and how it was on a Kickstarter 12 years ago at this point or something like that. I know there's issues there. I will still defend Star Citizen a little bit because it's more of a game. It's more playable. There's more to do in it nowadays than people really expect. I would say if you're on the team, like, oh, you can't even play it, it's vaporware. And no, it's not. Actually go and look at it. But that's a completely separate topic for a completely separate video. I'm going to wrap this one up. Thank you guys so much for watching. Again, if you'd like to submit a question, you can leave a comment below on YouTube or head over to Patreon. That's patreon.com/Devillore. If you're a patron over there, if you sign up, you will have access to not only the posting for this episode, where you can just leave a comment right there if you like, but there will also be a link inside that posting that takes you to a form you can fill out, which will allow you to ask your question that way as well. And patrons do get first priority on questions being asked here on the show. Yeah, you can also check out devillore.com. I've got some merch over there. If you've got ideas for other merch you'd like to see, let me know. Anyway, that's going to be it. Thanks again so much for watching, guys. I'll see you later.